What up YouTube? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be looking at how you can use Meshmixer to help you support and print some smaller models. As well as that, we will be sending the results to a YouTube channel called Miniature Madness, who will be using them for some interesting projects. So, let's get into it. So like I said in the intro, this video is in collaboration with Andre from the Miniature Madness YouTube channel, and we both thought that this would be an excellent opportunity to talk to you about supporting smaller models. I find Meshmixer gives you a lot more control when you're trying to support tiny details. Also, supports are very easily broken away as the contact points are only as big as your nozzle diameter. Anyway, enough talk, let's get over to Meshmixer and I'll show you what I mean.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally? But you merely adopted the dark. I was born in it!
Jeez, it looks like Cthulhu now, oh my god. So here we are inside a Cura, and I just wanted to demonstrate the tree supports. Now, they work quite well. We're actually just demonstrating it with the that model. And you see, it actually does a fairly decent job of, like, I mean, apart from the sport interface, this probably needs to be turned off. But in general, it does a good job of getting all the main bits, like there, it's got that under there, even this tiny bit under here it's managed to get. But when you start going down to a really small model, like this one, you see it struggles with a bit of the finer details. You see that bits of support are just, you know, here for some reason, like here. It's, to be fair, it's gotten better in this newer version. The older version of Cura, which I actually originally did this with, couldn't even achieve this. So this is actually getting better. Like, good work from Ultimaker. But yeah, for something this small, I find that using Meshmixer support is a lot better. You could have got a lot more control of what you can do with it. So let's just import a model. So let's import our this one into Meshmixer, and I'm using this one mainly because I actually have footage of this one. So that's probably a good idea. So the first thing we want to do is probably just scale this down a bit to the actual right size we want. So if you go to edit and then transform, and then we want uniform scaling turned on so it scales and keeps the aspect ratio of the original model. And we want to go to Y, because on 3D printers they go Z up, but in Meshmixer it's Y is up. So you want to change your Y value here to be 90mm, well, whatever your scaling value, obviously. And then to get it to sit nice on the bed, you just want to half whatever your scale for your Y value is. So if you set that to 45, it'll then sit nice on the bed. So if you accept, and then we're good. Okay, next we want to generate our support. So if we go into analysis, that one, and then go to overhangs, and then you'll see that all the red areas are what it seems to be overhangs and may need support, but it's all based on what settings you put here. So I would recommend starting with something like the Ultimaker 2 profile. This has got the standard 0.4, so that'll be the tip diameter will be the size of your nozzle, because that's how big you can physically print. And layer height obviously will be whatever layer height you're using, so in my case 1.0.16. and then to begin with, I think just leave everything as is, and then we'll see what it comes up with. We'll let it number crunch for a moment. So as you can see, it generates, but there's a few little issues, but this is why we want to start somewhere and then fine tune. But yeah, the actual post diameter of this being 3mm for a tiny little print, even this sort of bigger one at 90mm, but definitely for the smaller ones, is just too thick. It can't get into the details that it needs to get into. So if we change the post diameter to sort of 2mm is a good starting point in my opinion. And also while we're at it, we might as well double check and make sure that allow top connection, sorry, is unchecked, because then that stops all these sort of things. You might get a few, but they won't be actively trying to generate on top of things like that. So once you've done that, then we want to like close one of these just so you can get to one of these, and then remove the supports that we've just generated and regenerate them. And this is kind of an iterative process, like you just make a change and fill about and see where you get the best results. See, this one's a lot better, a lot more areas supported, and it being 2mm has even got some of the final details of the nose and stuff. It's even got a couple around the back here, which I don't think this is strictly needed, but it's not too bad. But again, even with this though, you've still got sort of little issues like this where this is printed, but I mean it's generated, sorry, but it hasn't generated a plinth at the bottom because there's just not enough room for it. So this sort of base here is set to 15mm by default, so you can play with it. If you've got a 2mm diameter thing, then probably 5 or 6mm is pretty good, so we'll go with 5. Remove the support and then regenerate it. One thing to note with this though, it is quite CPU intensive, so if you've got a slower computer this will take a little while, but it's not too bad. It takes about, like, even on a slow computer, only takes like 5-10 minutes. But there we go, see, it's managed to cover a lot more areas now. In this particular model, these are actually probably a little bit unnecessary, mainly because the overhang angle is set to 45 degrees and most printers can do 50 quite happily. Even the Creality, their base profile I think is set to something like 61, so we don't need all of these. I mean, you can if you want, like, just to make sure, but it's not entirely necessary. But anyway, this is, you see what I mean down here, all these bases can now actually fit and actually have got a base rather than being printed in the air. That's one thing you want to make sure of, because if it's printed in the air, then obviously it's not going to do anything. So I'll go through these settings sort of individually and then you can see the effects of it. The angle threshold is actually the angle in which these overhangs show up, so you can see if you set it to say 50 degrees, it then covers more of an area. It's kind of backwards in my opinion, because if you set it to 50 in Cura, it actually then removes some, so it's kind of back to front. But in general, the less amount you have here, the less support, the more support then. So if we go down to 40, that means less areas are covered, and that means less support will be generated, which is pretty useful. If you know your printer's capable of doing the higher angles, then you can just knock that down to about 40. If you've got a good fan, you could probably go further than that, but 40, 45 is pretty good. Okay, so I'm reading from an article here because there doesn't seem very much information on this next setting, but the contact tolerance is the threshold between two faces. So if the distance between an overhang and another face is below this value, it will not be detected as an overhang. What does that mean? I assume, again, there's a lack of information about this, but I assume is if you've got this face and then this face sort of directly opposite it, if that value is below whatever you set it to, it then just won't see it as an overhang and it won't bother trying to print it. But as you can see, I've just generated this one, and I would have thought under here this wouldn't have generated because that and that, unless it's specifically faces. But yeah, it's all generated exactly the same, and that's set to the max value. So if anybody knows sort of a better description for this, please do comment down below and put it in the description, because then other people will know what the hell it's for. and it also will help others sort of make use of this setting. Your Y offset is if you wanted, for whatever reason, the model itself to be so far off the build plate. So say if you wanted it to be, I don't know, 20 mils up, it will then generate with 20 mil gap at the bottom. If I'd actually changed it in the right value, one moment, there we go. So then when it generates, I'll generate it here, 1 second, put 20 in. So as you can see, it's generated underneath the model now. It's actually pushed the model up and it generated it underneath the model here. And this would be very useful for if you've got a model with an uneven bottom, or you've got like a round edge on the bottom, something like that, and you need to support a certain area. Pushing that model up a little bit could allow some of these connections to generate where they wouldn't do normally, because you've got to have a minimum amount of space before the actual tree support will then generate. So that's very useful, but also very CPU intensive, because it took quite a while to generate that did, but set back to that to 0 because we don't need it. So next we've got max angle. This is just the max angle that you want these tree supports to be. I wouldn't mess with this too much, because obviously if one of these fails, then the point that it's actually going to support is going to fail as well. Or, well, it might not fail, but it might not look as good. So it's a trade-off. I'd rather set this value and keep it at 45 degrees and have these definitely print, rather than push the boundaries too much and then have a failed print at the end. But this is obviously personal preference, and it's also down to your printer itself. So if you've got a really good printer, then that won't be an issue. You could go up and down with that. Density is probably, as the name suggests, it's how dense sort of these points are going to be here. So I think by default it sets them to about 75, but if you up this value, there'll be more connections. If you lessen the value, there'll be less connections. I'll see if I can demonstrate that with this. This is actually probably quite a good bit to demonstrate that with. So if I whack this up to, or lower it, because then it will generate quicker, to say 50, and there we go. You can see that the amount of connections on the bottom of this is drastically sort of reduced. So if you've got a model that is perhaps not, like, you're not sure whether it needs support, it probably would print on its own, but you just want to have a few little connections here and there to help with that. So reducing this would then help a lot with that. Same in the opposite direction. If you set it to 100%, so it's a higher density, take a lot longer to generate, but that area will be much better supported. So it's a trade-off again. Next height, obviously we've seen layer height. That's just the layer height you're going to be printing at. Post diameter, situational, smaller models, you probably want to reduce that. Don't go lower than 1mm though, because any lower than that, you're sort of borderline whether it'll actually be able to print properly. Tip diameter, this should be the same as your nozzle, so if you're using a 0.5 or a 0.6, change that to 0.5 or 6, or bigger, of course. Base diameter, this is just the, ooh dear, too far, these little connection points at the bottom. If it can, it'll generate it and do like a gradual slope like this, but if it can't, it will just then basically put a little raft underneath each connection, like so. So that's it for support generator. And then we're just under advanced support. This is where the allow top connections is. For most of the time, you want this to be turned off, just because it creates a bit of a funkiness when it actually prints the part and stuff like that, or whatever. There's some situations, if you've got a flat surface, it would then work fine. But it's, for most cases, you want this turned off. Optimization, this is just how long it takes to optimize sort of the placement of everything, that kind of thing. So turning it up will take a lot longer to generate, but you'll have much more optimized sort of placements for things. But turning it down, less optimized, but then it means like my old laptop could probably do it. So it, again, I've just left this set to 50. 50 seems pretty damn good. Okay, next, the solid min offset is the offset between sort of this and how much distance away from the actual model itself is. So if we set this value to something, I don't know, let's go mad, let's go 0.3 and then regenerate it. So as you can see, the distance between these posts away from the model is now greater. It's only very small, but I've found that the default one works great or whatever. It doesn't actually affect sort of how these connect. These still connect to the model pretty much butted up against each other, but that is just because the tips where they actually connect to the model are so small, they break really easily anyway. So that just allows you, so if it stops things like this sticking too much to your model, if you've got a particularly sort of detailed model, that you might want to up that a tiny bit to make sure it doesn't stick and ruin any of your details. But yeah, like I said, the default works pretty well for me. The next setting is the tip height, and the tip height is just the height between this and this, so the transition point between where it goes from 2mm or whatever you've set the post diameter to be the 0.4, which is the connection sort of point. So if we adjust that to I don't know, 0.5, let's half it and then regenerate. You can see the point where it connects to now, this is actually a lot smaller. So the base height is much of the same. It is the height of this little bit here. So if we set that, say, to 1mm and then regenerate. So there you are, you can see the base heights have all changed to 1mm. And this goes for if it's got enough room to do this sort of cone shape as well. It'll do that sort of outwards if it's got enough room to do it. But obviously in this case it's only got enough room to do the rafts. But yeah, this is quite useful for some slices, just in case it doesn't detect it for any reason. You can up it and it'll make sure it actually prints it. Strut density is actually the density of struts that goes up to the part. So say this point here, whatever, it's only got one piece that's going up and supporting all of this and then all of this. So this is something that this may fail, or it might knock on the nozzle and fail at some point. So if you up the strut density to, say, I don't know, we'll put it to 2, and then regenerate, be a Time Lord. Okay, I actually have to up it to 100 to actually get it to show with this model, but obviously it's definitely very geometry dependent. But as you can see now here, there was only like one that came up from here and then went all the way up around and then up and down. Whereas now there's got an extra strut that goes up to this one, an extra strut here, an extra strut that goes off to this one. Same with this one here, this only had one before, whereas this has 2 now. Same with that one there. And yeah, generally it adds more support, but then does use more material and will take a little bit longer to print. So it's, again, very geometry dependent, but for a model like this actually would make sense turning this up. But yeah, the final setting is just the post sides, and all this post sides is just the amount of sides that each of these sides. See if each, oh dear, see each flat on here, this sort of circle diameter is made up of 16 sides. So if you up this to, oh well, actually we'll lower it because then it'll be easier to generate. If we remove that and then do it with just 4 sides, each of the support pieces should now be square, in theory. We'll have a look. So now you can see all the support struts are all now square, and that's obviously because we set it to 4 sides, but depending on how many sides, it will then just divide the shape up amongst how many sides you tell it to. I'm not actually sure how much use this is. I mean, I've only ever used the standard 16 sides and to make circular posts and stuff, and that's worked fine. It hasn't sort of had any issues and things, so could be useful for certain geometries, but it's good to know nonetheless. Well, there you go, there's the settings that I use for this particular model, but obviously this, depending on your own geometry or whatever, you might need to tweak these a lot. But those are all the main settings, but it doesn't actually stop there. You can, if I could click that off, sort of add in extra struts and add in support pieces where, say it's, this is probably a good example here, that you want it to be supported a bit more across here. You can click, and wherever it can find its own space, it'll do it, and it'll add in extra supports. See, so this bit here is probably a bit too much for it to think, but so that's, so you can add in your own sort of custom supports in different areas, but you can click like that, but you can also click and drag to somewhere as well. So you want to there, for example, you want that specifically supported there, you can click to drag there. That's probably not going to be good enough. It won't let you, oh dear, it's done that at a weird angle, isn't it? It won't let you put it there if it can't find a space for it to go. So if it can't physically do it within the parameters that you've set, it won't do it. But you can sort of override this if you hold shift, and if you pull, see here, it's like red, it can't do it because it's interfering with the model. But if you hold shift, it then will let you do it. But this obviously would be not very good because this is also at a steep angle and then it intersects with the model and through these other bits and stuff like that. So use that very sparingly, use that only if you really need to. But what I did for this model was I actually used it to just add in a few extra points under these bits that I wanted to be really nice and sort of crisp. So wherever you can, just click them in, get them in, and there we are. So that's that area nice and supported. The same with like the nose and the mouth, that kind of thing. You could probably, is it gonna get me? Kind of. But yeah, you get the general idea. And also, if you have a point like this, for example, here, and you think, oh, actually, I'm not sure whether that'll print all right. So only if you click somewhere on this point, it'll then add in extra struts as well. So if you're unsure about this, for example, this is a good example, it's one piece supporting that and all of this, then you can sort of click and add in a few more struts just for that one piece. Obviously, this will use more material, but it then allows you to guarantee that'll print okay. So things like this will be fine because it's like literally only supporting one thing. It's only supporting itself essentially. This is another good example. You might want to add a few more in, so that just to make sure that looks nice at the bottom. But yeah, the other thing to mention is you can actually remove these pieces as well, both the ones you've added as well as the ones that's generated, by holding control and clicking, and then it'll remove whichever one that was there. But it'll also remove quite a bit. If it can't find anywhere else for that particular piece to go, it'll remove a lot. So just be again, use that sparingly. Only use that for maybe the ones that you've added yourself, and then that way you can clean things up a lot. But this here, for example, probably doesn't need support, so you can say, oh, I can remove that. So there, probably not as well, I can remove that kind of thing. So that's also useful. You can also mix and match. So we've generated this with a 2mm post diameter, but say you've got some really intricate stuff like the nose that you want to sort of try and support, but these ones are just too big to fit in there. You can then set the post diameter to 1, and you don't need to regenerate. You can just then click and sort of there, for example, this is a really small area, so but there you can see you can add in different size diameter supports and stuff, and then helps it to print better, because obviously you don't want the whole thing to print in 1 minute. Well, unless you're doing a really small model, then it wouldn't matter. But for a slightly bigger model like this, you're better off doing your main bulk in a sort of bigger post diameter, so like 2mm, 3mm perhaps. And then for any really finicky tiny details that you want to make sure is supported but won't fit one of these posts in, you can then add in your own sort of smaller posts later on. But yeah, that's the main bulk. I think all the settings covered. So finally, we'll actually just want to convert it to a solid, and then we can export it as an STL. So if we convert to solid, and we'll make a new object, and then we'll crash. Okay, we're back. Something about that last model it just didn't like, and it crashed on me. So yeah, the last thing we want to do is just to convert it to a solid, and then we'll do it as a new object. And then this way it allows you to export it as an STL, as a separate STL. So now you want to export these as two different models, and you'll see why in a moment. But if we export this, you see I've already done it once to make sure it worked this time, and hit save. And then yes, we want to go over the top of it. And then we'll do the same by clicking the other one, and then going to export, and then we'll do this one as 2. This is kind of my naming convention, but you name it something, you'll know what it is. And one thing to note, if you haven't got this object browser up for a reason it didn't show up, you can go to view and then show object browser there. And yeah, then export on each one. So then we'll go back to Cura, we'll get rid of this one, and we'll import this one here. We'll import both models, just make it easier. And you see you've got one that's support and the one that's not support. And let's turn off the built-in, because this will take about 10 years to try and work it out if I don't. So the reason we export them as two different models like this and import them separately is because now you can click this model and go to your per model settings, and you can add in sort of settings based on what you want just for the support. So for example, you could add in a wall line count, and for your support you probably only want it to be, alright, go away, you probably only want it to be say 1 or 2, not 12. So I'll probably do 2, but this is just because I'm paranoid about these supports, because they are quite small. So I do 2 just to make sure they print nicely. And yeah, like you can have custom densities and things like that, but the main one I set is the wall lie count, and also I do density fill. Get to it, Will. Come on, man. Am I doing... Oh, I missed an F. Density, so we would have an infill density. I like to set this to 0, because obviously being support, we don't need it. It only needs to be the 2 surrounds. So this has got its own nice lot of settings now. If we go to preview under the slicer, well, there we go. There's the custom settings we've set for our support, and we've got the 0 density and the 2 wall line count for things, which will save material, which is quite nice. But I know you're thinking, Will, they're not touching each other. Yeah, I'm getting to that, don't worry. If you select one and then select the other, so if you select one and then hold shift and select the other, and then right click and go merge models, and specifically merge models, what it will do, it'll then combine them together in the same exact position that Meshmixer put them in, but it'll still have the custom settings we've set for the support, but then they'll now be one model perfectly positioned and they'll print nicely together. So if I let this slice, and you can see that everything is in place. All these are nice. Our support pieces are all together and nice. And if you look down through the layers, you can see that the support pieces have still got the custom support setting that we've custom density in that we've set, but then the main model doesn't. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you probably noticed that there is actually a print as support option, but the trouble is if you select this option and then we'll let it slice, there we go. As you see, it tries to use the geometry that we've set, but then it tries to generate it as regular support. So you've got all these different sort of upright pieces trying to join to it, and see, that's the original shape, but it's filled in all this area because it thinks we want just regular supports, and no, we actually want it to be sort of tree support. So that's why you set it to if I set this one, you set it to normal mode and then add in your changes, because then that way it'll actually print it how you intended it to be. At this point, you're just ready to print. So I'll just put in a few sort of little clips of it printing, and then we'll see you afterwards. Well, there you have it. There's the final print. It printed really well. The support material didn't have any sort of fails or anything like that. It also breaks away really easily, and because of how tiny the connection points are, it barely leaves any sort of imperfections on the surface. So it's really, really good for these small models. You can see you can get some really fine details from an FDM 3D printer. You don't have to go to resin to get some quite really good results. In case you're wondering, all the models were printed at 0.12 layer height. And they took a while, let's say. Like this one here is only 40mm tall, I believe, and each one of these took over an hour. I think it was about 2 hours per model to print, but as you can see, the result is actually really good. For this last photo, I added in a pound coin for scale, so you can see they're quite small. So as you can see, Meshmixer is a really powerful piece of software, and it's completely free. It's one of those tools that you really need in your repertoire if you're going to be 3D printing anything. So over to you, Andre. Let me know what you think. I'll put a link in the video description for his video and his channel, as well as somewhere in the cards. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, please like, comment and subscribe. It helps me out a lot. And I shall see you next time. Ta-da!